This is the Planetary Potential Podcast for those who are eager to explore entrepreneurship, innovation, and cross-cultural communication in exciting and interesting places around the world. And now, here's your host, Andrew P. Rowan.
Welcome to episode 4 of season 1. What do you do when you're awakened by an 8.0 magnitude earthquake at 2:45 in the morning while on the 9th floor? At least 3 of us, all staying in separate buildings, went on Twitter, and 2 of us ended up meeting in person. The following interview with J.B. Holston, an entrepreneur and business operator who joined academia in 2015 as the dean of the University of Denver's Daniel Felix Ritchie School of Engineering and Computer Science, is the indirect result of that earthquake. JB shares what it was like bringing an outside perspective to the University of Denver, the frameworks he utilizes to get stuff done, as well as how to build out networks of networks. An important reminder that opinions shared on this episode are those of individual guests. For more information, please visit www.andrewprowan.com/disclosures. To date, this was the earliest interview I've done since we met at 6 a.m. because I had an investor workshop to join right after. So let's head to the Belmont Miraflores Park to kick things off. With me is J.B. Holston. He's the dean of the Daniel Felix Ritchie School of Engineering and Computer Science at the University of Denver. We are in Lima, Peru, and we happened to meet by happenstance. There was an earthquake here over the weekend. We were both on Twitter. Both happened to be on the 9th floor. And actually, the comment that JB was responding to on Twitter, the person was also on the 9th floor. And we ended up finding a way to connect and meeting in person a few days ago. So welcome, JB.
Thanks very much. It's good to be here. Good to talk to you.
And I think that kind of meeting is only possible in the 21st century and after, because thinking, 20 years ago, if that situation had happened, we would have been like ships passing in the night.
No, that's exactly right. Well, not only would we not have known that we were both here, suffering through that at the same time, but the building probably wouldn't have stood up.
Well,
possibly wouldn't have stood up.
That's certainly more frightening to think about.
Lots of technology improvements that allowed for this.
So I'm here in the 4th week here in Peru. You are getting ready to leave soon because this trip is a special one.
Yes, that's right. This is primarily a social trip for me. So we've been here for about 2 weeks, and yesterday was my wife and my 30th anniversary. So we were down here to celebrate that.
That's wonderful. Congratulations.
Thanks very much.
Now, I know you've been in South America before. You took a trip, a university-related trip in 2015 or 2016, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
Is this your second time in South America?
I have been to Brazil a couple of times. This is the first time to Peru. And I've also spent time in Argentina as well. But I haven't spent a ton of time in other parts of the region. And the Brazil trip in particular was startup-oriented, ecosystem development-oriented. I was traveling with the governor, the then governor of Colorado, now one of the 30 or so candidates for president on the Democratic side of the U.S. And we were in Sao Paulo and Rio in particular, meeting with a bunch of different folks in that ecosystem to talk about Colorado relations, but it had a real innovation focus.
So I know that this is more of a social trip for you, but in the context of your other data points in South America, what are your impressions of Peru thus far, or even just of Lima? I'm not sure how widely you've traveled in the country.
We've traveled some, but it's been more as a tourist. So I think when you and I were speaking the other day, we talked about SMBs, SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, and that is where the bulk of the economic energy is in the country. It's interesting to me. It doesn't feel as confident a place in some ways as others I've been. You and I were talking about how wonderful it is in food. Lima has become a foodie place known around the world, for example. But its ability to kind of promote itself and to know what that means and to scale that. If you compare it to, and I know the comparisons are never great, but there's a lot of interesting hard work going on is my perception, but not a lot of confidence that that's truly entrepreneurial or that really could or should scale or what that might mean. And I don't know the degree to which that's bound up in the political history of the country. I think, if you look at the long cast of Peruvian history, it isn't a place that's considered itself a victor often. as it's currently constructed. And so it just doesn't seem to exude that same kind of self-confidence to scale in some ways. Now, those are very, that's an American dropping in for a couple of weeks.
Sure. Now, when you had said confidence originally, I thought, were you referring to confidence or perhaps optimism? Because, of course, there is some closeness to the two.
Yeah.
And thinking of, for example, in Brazil, I think that the level of happiness and the exuberance is quite well known in a place like Brazil.
Right.
Especially if you've ever been to Disney World and there are these tourist groups from Brazil, young kids just having a blast, chanting in queues.
Yeah.
You can really see those elements of their personality and culture shine through. Here, similarly, I've been in Lima. I spent some time in Piura. Very, very different in terms of the climate. The Piuran siesta is a bit famous in the sense that it's so hot. About 1 o'clock, folks eat for 45 minutes, and then they don't come back to work until 4 p.m.
Right.
That doesn't happen here in the capital. That was something that some of my colleagues and friends in Piura had trouble adjusting to when they came to the capital for work, for example, which is understandable. In Vietnam also, siesta is quite common, and that's also partially due to the heat, but also the early wake-up time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think it does. I think there's certainly regional differences, as you mentioned. And again, this is an impression coming in orthogonally, and I think that's difficult to generalize from. But, people are incredibly hardworking in the places where we've been for the most part. They're very industrious, but you have a sense of industriousness without necessarily a belief that or an understanding or framework for saying, great, I'm going to create this thing, which is going to go on to become this bigger thing, which can then become a national thing or a global thing. Those kinds of pathways just don't seem like they're on the roadmap or visible to a lot of folks here.
But those are very different mindsets, which I think emerge from different economic conditions, access to resources, of course, examples in the community, and so on. In this instance, in Peru, you just don't have, for example, like a Rappi coming from Colombia that's a $1 billion+ company,
right,
whereby people can see that and say, we can do it too.
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge psychological inflection point for a market. Of course, you could also look at it and say it's a great opportunity to be a pioneer and to be that example for the community. I think also another side of it is the large informality of the economy here.
Mm-hmm.
And when you are operating at the peripheral or under the radar, it's very hard to scale, right? Because in some ways, the larger you become, the more of a target you become for enforcement of regulations or laws or something like that, right? Now, your background is interesting because about 5 years ago, you entered into the academy, right? And so you're coming from the private sector and you joined the University of Denver. Can you talk to me a bit about what have been the differences in making that transition? Mm-hmm. And then also looking back on the time of your deanship at the Daniel Felix Ritchie School of Engineering and Computer Science. What have been some of your proudest accomplishments since then?
Yeah, it's so when I first decided to do it, most of my business friends thought I was completely nuts because the perception, of course, of the academy from outside is that it's sclerotic, it's old school, it's past the pivot point, and doesn't know it, that you can never change things at the pace that you want to, and I think to some degree, I think there's some truth to that. I think that pace of change is the single biggest issue, the biggest concern I'd have in that institution in the U.S., not particularly the University of Denver, but higher ed generally, because the governance structure of these things is not designed to be agile. At all. And I'll come back to that in a second. But I think the two things that were most surprising to me coming in were that academics really are mini entrepreneurs. If you sort of look at how they have to build their careers, if they're going to be tenure track in particular, it's all about kind of scrambling to generate enough of a brand in their particular discipline or subdiscipline that as they run through that tenure track gauntlet, they've got enough supporters in their field that when the time comes, the vote is yes, and they're highly focused on getting that done. And in order to do that, they've got to run around usually with a lot of independence, particularly in a smaller kind of context where it's sort of a barbell in higher ed. The really large entities and then the entities that are not that aren't in the middle. You're really on your own as an academic. You've got to go make it on your own. But if you're at Caltech, one or two of you will survive or whatever the number is, and so you better be able to figure that out. And if you're at a smaller university, there's just not a lot of infrastructure. So the entrepreneurial nature of what it means to have an academic career in a very traditional academic way was kind of eye-opening, because again, if you're in the outside, if you're in the business world, you just don't expect that. But the governance structures are an issue. Tenured faculty can veto pretty much any change, or at least can slow the process of change down. And when and you tend to have a lot of turnover in administration in higher ed, and so when you have this kind of pocket veto among the partners in the venture firm, and then this rotating management on top, which is kind of what that structure looks like, it can be difficult to move things along at pace. So what I found is that you really got to understand the difference between collaboration and consensus. Like, collaboration is a must in terms of the process for decision taking in higher ed, but you're never going to get to consensus on anything. And so, at best it's asymptotic. So you have to sort of understand when you're close enough to be able to actually affect change and get things to happen. A lot of what we've tried to do at the university since I've been there has been to create initiatives that kind of pull the university along, and particularly into the community, and particularly into the entrepreneurial and innovation ecosystem in a lot more directly, and to do that through kind of non-traditional means. So, my solution to the pace of change issue has been to say, hey, I know how difficult it is to do cross-discipline initiatives, for example, around innovation and entrepreneurship. So rather than create an institute, let's create a project. Let's call it something different. Let's have it have an alpha phase and a beta phase, and maybe never get beyond the beta phase instead of what often happens in that kind of setting, which is you spend a year or 2 years or 3 years or longer planning the thing before you do it. And then when you're really sure that no one is going to kill it, you launch it. Right. And Project Excite is one of those. Excite means cross. X is cross discipline. ITE is innovation, technology, and entrepreneurship. And it's a funny story. So I came in and I talked to the dean of the business school and the dean of the law school. And I said, gee, for most of the scaling, rising entrepreneurial companies in Colorado who want to have a relationship to the University of Denver, they look at the thing and say, well, you've got a bunch of different deans and all these different organizations, and and you want me to co-create these relations? Forget it. I got no time. So I said, why don't we instead sort of play to our strength, which is the university. Really, the university its strength is more its scale as a university than any one of the different schools or topics of study or programs within it. So why don't we create a university-wide initiative around this so that we can go to the community and say you can plug into us, and also go to students, say you can plug into that startup ecosystem.
So it's almost like this interface.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it. So it's just an easier, interpreted place that both sides can easily plug into. That's right, which goes AC to DC and whatever kind of conversion you want to talk about. So I went to my colleagues and they said, well, you can't just create one of those. And they said, well, what do you mean I can't just create one of those? And talk to the chancellor. She's like, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's go do it. So I said, well, if we can't just create one of those, what do we need to do? And they said, well, you need a white paper. So I said, okay, great. So I went back and I wrote a white paper over the weekend. On Monday, I went back to my colleagues and said, okay, here's the white paper. Can we do it now? And the general view was, well, now you can start the conversation with a broader set of constituents because you have a white paper that can be the sort of emissary victim that everyone can attack for the next 2 to 3 years and make sure we don't do it. I said, well, that doesn't make sense. So I went to the chancellor and said, well, why not? Because in higher ed, the dirty little secret is money solves everything. So I went to the chancellor and said, well, why don't you just kickstart this thing? Just throw some money in. We'll agree we're going to give it a start. We'll call it a project so that nobody gets crazy. We'll say this is the alpha phase, we'll give ourselves permission to fail, which is one of the big problems in higher ed. It's a little bit like entrepreneurship in Germany that I found when I was living over there. There isn't any sort of inherent existential permission to fail in higher ed. So I said, let's do that. Let's create it. Let's agree that if it doesn't work, that's okay. It can go away. It'll be fine. And off we went to the races. And it then became a much higher profile interface for the university to the innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystems, not just in Denver, not just in Colorado, but much more broadly. That's what led to the relationship with the United Nations around the Solution Summit and the Sustainable Development Goals, et cetera. So I'm proud of that because I think it really changed a couple of things. One is the perception of the university within certain circles, where instead of being this ivory tower that was siloed, that was impossible to figure out, et cetera, it was, oh yeah, there's this cool way that I can interact with, and that students can cut across boundaries, et cetera. But it also, I think, showed the rest of the university that it's okay to try that sort of thing on a more fleet basis and take a kind of agile approach, and nothing terrible happened. So that's just one example of bringing sort of an outside perspective on how you might change something to
there's definitely value on being an outsider in terms of noticing what is existing in the current culture. And I want to ask you a follow-up about that orientation to failure. Do you think that perhaps it's the personality types that are drawn to academia, whereby you are clearly driven if you're going to complete a higher level education degree, you've put in the time to research, you have these credentials or pedigree, and taking a risk outside of that comfort zone, I imagine must be somewhat jarring. And then the possibility, or even an increased possibility of failure combined with that. And then, especially in a community, I imagine that must be almost suffocating at times.
It's a great question, Andrew. And I've still, I'm only 4 years in, which is like a nanosecond in academic terms. But it isn't obvious because, back to the point about the faculty being fundamentally entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
On the one hand, they're putting in, pick a number, 20, 25 grants applications a year, where if it's an NSF-oriented grant in most fields, you may have a 1 in 16 shot at best. And if you're from a smaller school and you're not well known and you're starting out, which is when you really need it, it's not even a 1 in 16 shot. So on the one hand, you've got to be extraordinarily entrepreneurial in order to try to
dogged.
Yeah,
because you hear no a lot.
Yeah, that's right. You got to be dogged, but you got to run around and try a bunch of stuff. You're going to get no a lot. So a lot of what sort of entrepreneurs think of as chasing money in Silicon Valley, that's sort of what academics are doing on the research side to build their careers. So you would think that would build a mentality of risk taking and understanding that failure is okay, and sort of getting through obstacle doggedness to your point. But on the other extreme, and understandably, when you get a PhD and you have a tenure, et cetera, and you're accredited, you have all these sort of, organizing principles around it, you come to a view that your knowledge and your discipline and your expertise is foundational to any kind of decision taking. And so there's an insistence that be respected in any kind of decision taking process. And then when you scale that up and say, great, at Harvard, for example, there's something like 100 deans, and rumor has it that no dean can have an initiative that cuts across another school or another dean's territory if that other dean doesn't agree. You got 100 people with a black ball, all of whom, historically are incredibly proud of their particular, rigor with respect to process. So it's sort of a yin and yang. On the one hand, you've got this, I individually as an academic have to be pretty entrepreneurial and dogged in order to be able to get my career moving and done. On the other hand, you put me into an institutional construct where I'm given a black ball essentially on anything that can happen, and I'm gosh darn going to double, triple, quadruple down on my expertise. So I don't think it's a lack of willingness to take risk per se. I think it's that the governance structures, and again, as I say, we're trying to figure this out, but I don't think the governance structures reward innovation and agility with respect to internal innovation. I would argue they do with respect to external success in your individual career, but that kind of communal, collectivist, break the boundaries, try something new. The incentives are skewed so that there are really limited incentives for a faculty member to participate actively in that. And it does, it looks messy, it looks expensive. If you think about an academic being asked to spend maybe 20% of their time on service, they tend to put this kind of activity into that bucket. And
I
so,
see.
they're looking for efficiency in that process. Instead, you say,
Okay.
well, look, we're all going to get together. It'll be fun. We'll try this stuff, and we have to meet a lot because who knows? And you got to respond quickly to the communications that are going to come at you in random ways. That in Slack, what's that? Oh, it'll be all right.
Now,
You
yeah, and now a bit earlier you mentioned collaboration versus consensus, and is that orientation or framework, was that something that you were aware of going in, or is it something that now you're looking back on and realizing you can pretty much drop whatever activity or process into one of those two groups?
Yeah, I think I realized over the course of my initial listening tour that that anything that wasn't collaborative inherently and sort of authentically and genuinely ran the risk of creating so much resistance that you weren't going to be able to implement it. So, came to understand the criticality of collaboration, but at the same pace understood that there's no way you're going to get to consensus for any kind of decision within a faculty co-governance kind of structure. So I think it pretty quickly emerged that was going to be a balance that was going to be required. But if you look at higher ed in the U.S. in general, the demographics, the cost of student debt, et cetera, if it isn't over the cliff, it's right there generally as an industry. And that's where I have the greatest concern about these sort of traditional governance structures versus the pace of change required to confront that looming change. Because, again, it's you got a whole lot of institutions that aren't inherently sustainable. They're very dependent on year-to-year revenue. And in a world where the source of that revenue and the ability of the folks who are providing that revenue to afford things and the number of choices they've got and the total demand is actually not in favor of the number of players that you've got right now at the price at which they're charging things, there's a lot of risk.
I'm sure there are many university administrators who are especially grateful of our international students who come to the U.S. And are willing to invest not only in their futures, of course, but in U.S. higher education. However, just goes to show you, especially with the decline of Chinese students in the U.S. as a result of geopolitical developments, how fragile elements of that are. And especially if you're talking about a consensus-based approach whereby there's not flexibility or adaptability baked into that organizational culture, it's very hard to fine-tune and to react to developments or even preempt developments as they come down the pipeline.
Yeah.
Wondering how you balanced initially at the beginning, being somebody coming from the outside and trying to inject new ideas or that dynamism from the private sector or however you want to frame it, because clearly they wanted you to come in and help to contribute in ways that were outside of that academia hemisphere, right? So how do you balance that with people who are either they have entrenched interests or they're used to the stability of the way things always have been,
right.
Pushing back, right? Yeah. Because it takes some time when you enter a new environment to get a sense of what's going on, to get your finger on the pulse, and to really figure out, what you can and can't do. And you want to, it's very hard to strike that right balance, especially because you don't want pushback from people saying, well, you just got here. We've been here for a decade and a half or whatever the case is. We tried that.
Right.
And it didn't work for XYZ reasons.
Yeah.
So wondering how you approach that.
Yeah.
Because generally a lot of it is just politics, right?
Yeah.
Managing relations.
Yeah.
But if there was something in particular that surprised you about coming in as an outsider,
right.
And now, of course, I'm sure after 4 years, you're viewed as a member of the community, right?
Yeah. It's a great question. Let me just address your international student point, though, briefly,
Please.
and then we'll go on to the other. So we did an analysis when the first Muslim travel ban came out about the impact on how much operating margin was contributed by international students in Colorado higher ed. And, essentially we found that the University of Colorado system, the entire profit margin arguably is equal to the full revenue pay for graduate students from abroad that go to that system. So if you attack that, or if you diminish the supply of those full pay students, arguably you're wiping out, the margin of public higher ed in a lot of states in the U.S. So these have very direct consequences. This is not it's too bad that, Chinese tourism is down 5% last year, which was what I was reading this morning in the U.S. It's that, public higher ed has become to depend entirely financially on this stream of particularly graduate-based students coming from countries, Muslim-based countries, and or China, Southeast Asia as well, who now have a lot of options, by the way, and are being told we're not interested. So I think more needs to be more focus on the actual economic consequence of those kinds of decisions is really critical, because higher ed generally isn't in a great, healthy economic position. The balance sheet for higher ed in total, public higher ed, particularly in the U.S., it doesn't look all that great. So when you take the most profitable supply of students away or attack them, there's a risk. In terms of change management and coming in from the outside, and really we've tried to do a couple of things. One is I did try to accommodate the pace of the institution with respect to traditional kinds of change. So spent a year kind of listening and not making big changes, then spent 6 months doing a strategic plan, which had, the bulk of all of the faculty in my particular school engaged in it. Interestingly, that 6-month period of time to do that strategic plan was considered to be an incredibly rapid process, because there are strategic plans that take 6 years to develop in higher ed, which is always astonishing to me. But I didn't come in on day one and say, great, we're going to do a strategic plan and you're all going to participate and we're all going to be happy and off we go to the races. It was, let's spend some time sort of getting used to one another and understanding one another. Then we will do a strategic plan. And then having done the strategic plan, really trying to hold everyone accountable to it, so that we could be specific enough in it that we could look to the things that we're going to try to get done year by year. We could quantify it, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
But in parallel, I mentioned Project Excite. We've set up a new project called the Colorado Media Project, which we started a year ago. I'm working with Senator Bennett, who's also now a candidate for president, on an artificial intelligence initiative for Colorado, where the University is central. So I've tried to do these activities that are outside of the traditional bounds of the structure of the university in parallel, with the university engaged in those, as a way to point to the way that we might do these things going forward, and then to engage people on a cross-discipline basis, but without so much specificity in those things from the start that you couldn't get them going until you had done all the planning. For me, if that were how we operated with respect to everything, then you'd literally never try anything.
Yeah, because I'm sure by the time you start to finalize the plan, elements of the plan have already changed because the conditions have changed.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
I want to talk a bit about your previous organization, the Blackstone Entrepreneurs Network, and the transition in terms of succession plan, and then also talk a bit about, after that, Colorado as a force on the global stage. So prior to your position as dean, you were with the Blackstone Entrepreneurs Network. Can you speak a bit about that? And then, of course, once you knew that you were leaving, what steps you took, or what kind of succession plan was implemented to make sure that that organization could continue to add value to its membership?
Yeah, that's a great question. I got engaged with that initiative. So the background of the Blackstone Entrepreneurs Network is very bound up in Blackstone itself. When Blackstone went public, they created a charitable foundation. And unlike some charitable foundations for private equity firms or investment banks, they not only provided a bunch of capital to that entity, but they also gave it a pretty broad remit to help develop entrepreneurial ecosystems around the world. But it wasn't just a funnel for kind of partners, largesse, into charities of interest to them. It was kind of a go help build entrepreneurial ecosystems kind of initiative for Blackstone out of New York. So the foundation had existed for a couple of years, not for very long, and kind of the origin story with respect to the entrepreneurial network for Colorado is that Senator Michael Bennett, was in New York visiting with Blackstone, and they mentioned that they had this foundation and they had this notion of setting up these Blackstone entrepreneurial networks in varieties of parts of the country. And he did what you'd want your senator to do and said, great, come to my state, do it in my state. So a bunch of Blackstone folks came out, spent quite a bit of time talking to a whole bunch of different folks. It was interestingly, they actually spent a great deal of time talking to a whole lot of different participants in the ecosystem, which was interesting because kind of not what you'd expect from, a big old hedge fund, private equity group that was looking to make an impact in an area. But they had a lot of concerns about whether the conditions on the ground were such that this notion of an entrepreneurial network could succeed. And the reason that they had those concerns is they tried one in North Carolina prior to Colorado, which, from the outside would look like it has a lot of attributes that are not dissimilar to Colorado's, but it had never really scaled as an initiative in the state. It had never really had the impact that I think they were looking to have. So they wanted to understand the conditions on the ground in Colorado. I had sold my interest in my last company, so I had some time, and I'm a big fan of the senator. The governor got involved. He and I were friends as well. And so when I got involved in that conversation, my push to them as a group was to not focus on the startup ecosystem, but instead on the scale-up ecosystem. If you looked at the issues in Colorado, arguably we had a lot of great energy around the startup community. The biggest startup week in Denver Startup Week in the world, and a reasonable amount of capital chasing new tech-oriented, in particular, startups. Some that were starting to have some success. You had a lot of the sort of, if you just looked at the density of startup activity and the volume of startup activity, Techstars that started, et cetera, there were a lot of really good things happening. So having them come in and put capital and effort toward that part of the value chain just didn't look that interesting. So instead we said, why don't we focus on scale up instead? Because what we don't have, or at least what we don't believe we don't have confidence that we've got, is enough of those scale up successes that from which lots of other great things can happen. You've now built your own talent can roll off and do other things, et cetera. So we convinced Blackstone to come in and focus the entrepreneurial network activity on scale up rather than startup in Colorado. And I said, look, I'm happy to come in and run this thing through its inception stages, get it going, and then we'll go from there. So spent a lot of time just trying to make connections that didn't historically exist in Colorado, which is, different industries. Folks who had serial successes, entrepreneurs in different industries and geographies, didn't know one another. The oil and gas folks in New York didn't know the natural foods folks in Boulder. They never crossed paths. And so we created a whole bunch of formal and informal methods for them to all connect, with a real benefit, in my view, from the start, always being whatever serendipitously would emerge by virtue of those connections happening, because they just didn't exist before. Got a whole bunch of folks on both sides of the network, folks that were running companies that could scale and folks that had run or had developed or had big roles in companies that had scaled across industries, across geographies, and, made this sort of fondue on an ongoing bubbling basis go for a couple of years. And it was terrifically successful. We had one big cybersecurity firm that is in its fourth private equity ownership round now, which is unbelievable to me, but is, and would have left the state, I think, probably when it merged with its primary rival outside of the state, if we collectively hadn't helped management and its investors and other figure out how to address some of the issues, get state incentives lined up, just do a bunch of the things that you want to do to create the conditions that would cause them to stay. So we had a lot of success. So I took it through, sort of foundation, startup, creation, and then
what year is this?
Boy, that's a great question. So at this point, it was probably 6 years ago, 2013.
Okay.
So sort of 2013 and 14, or 2013 through 15 were the sort of conception and inception stages for the initiative. And interestingly, it was funded. The grant money we flowed through the University of Colorado because Blackstone needed to flow this through some kind of philanthropic entity. So it had a higher ed connection, but that was reasonable to have it flow through there rather than a necessary condition of success for the effort. So did that, had a lot of success. And then in my case, the University of Denver had a brand new chancellor, a woman who'd come in. She'd been president of Swarthmore. She'd been at Colgate as president. She'd been at Emory in senior positions. She'd been all over. Decided she was going to come west and sort of make an impact to really change the way higher ed was done. So reached out to me in looking for a new dean in engineering and computer science because I knew a lot of folks in the community. I made the mistake of printing out the job description, leaving it on my desk. My wife looked at it and said, "Oh, that's you." I said, "What are you talking about? There's nothing to do. There's nothing in there that sounds like me." But we've been married for 30 years. So she She was right. I was wrong. So that all developed after a couple of years of doing the Blackstone thing, which is a little earlier than I had anticipated, handing off the reins to that, which gets to the answer to your question. I ended up in a position where I was going to make a move out of that role of executive director for the network sooner and faster than I had anticipated. So the good news and the bad news about being a pretty small ecosystem is, I could call up 20 different people that I knew and respected and thought were great. And we could, as an executive committee for the network, collectively consider a reasonably limited set of people without too formal a process to take the reins and then take it the next step. And the fellow who is now the executive director, a guy named Greg Greenwood, is someone that I'd known through other entrepreneurial ecosystem initiatives. There's an effort called Colorado Companies to Watch. He'd had one of those. I'd had one of those. We'd gotten to know each other through that. And, I think we collectively felt that Greg had kind of the energy and the disposition and the attitude for that kind of networking of networks kind of role, and asked him to take the lead. But your point, I think, fundamentally is a good one, which is the whole question of what's the long range plan for an initiative like that in a state like Colorado, and how do you make sure that endures across not just leadership changes within the network itself, but also leadership changes at the state level. We had the former governor, who was a two-term governor, was an incredible supporter of that initiative. And he was in his role for 8 years as governor. And prior to that, he was mayor of Denver for 8 years. So we had sort of 16 years of, an ability to have an open dialogue about across the aisle about the innovation ecosystem in Colorado. And that was a big part of the appeal for Blackstone to come to Colorado. They weren't going to come in and have anybody blackball their efforts, whereas they would look at other states and say, well, if we come in and we talk to that senator, the other one will never have anything to do with us, or the governor will never have it. That sort of wasn't the case in Colorado. So, the plan to create sufficient scale and momentum and activity and the right kind of long-term roadmap for the initiative so that it can survive through all of those transitions. I think we're still working on that to a degree. But having said that, I think that's okay, because to your other question about Colorado on the international scale, I'll pivot to that a little bit, or on the international stage. The things that Colorado needs to do to help its ecosystem develop, I would argue, have changed a ton, even over the last 6 or 7 years. 20 years ago, it really was about the startup ecosystem. There was some of that in Boulder, in tech, and that was it. Or at least that was all that there was perceived to be. In reality, like all oil and gas was entrepreneurial. It was just financial engineering. It was a different kind of entrepreneurship. But the perception was that Colorado had, it had oil and gas, it had some agriculture, and it had some cable, and that was it. And that was kind of true. So getting enough just startup activity and creating enough of a hub around all of that was a lot of what had to happen in the early 2000s. And so the creation of things like Techstars, the foundation of other kind of scaling up a foundry group, just a bunch of things that went on in that time frame. Then I think it became a lot more about scale up, because I remember in the sort of 2005, 6, 7 period, when you'd try to, if you were scaling up a startup company, I had it at that point, we were about 100 folks. You didn't have a lot of people locally who could fill those senior roles that were going to take it from 100 to 1,000, because there weren't a lot of folks around that had done that. And when you would try to get those folks to move to Colorado from a place like San Francisco or Seattle or wherever, New York, wherever they may have been, they kind of look at Colorado and go, well, if I come out there and it doesn't work, what's going to happen to me, right? There aren't 30 of these things right down the road that I can. So those were the conversations we were having. Now it's very different. Now it's like, if I could find any way in the world to move to Denver, I will go do that. Why? I don't know, but I think I want to go. And I'm not going to worry about how much opportunity there is. So the issues now for Colorado are a little bit more, well, gee, how do you grow from where you are? How do you become, in my mind at any rate, how do you become more of a global player than you were perceived to be? You sort of went from not even being a serious regional actor at least in the sort of innovation and startup and tech kind of community to being, one of the most intense startup oriented communities, really all up and down the Front Range in particular. But as a state of any of the states in the country, what's this next step? How do you take that? And does it even make sense to think that way? So thinking about things like what you do with the Blackstone Entrepreneurs Network is really critical. It's critical to put it into the context of where the state generally is trying to go.
Well, there's certainly an opportunity today, given the direction at the federal level, for states to emerge more as their own identities, or even a block of states to emerge separate from one vision
of course, to offer an alternative, or I guess you could also argue a consistent vision. One of the themes that I've noticed in the course of our discussion has been cross-sector, cross-industry. Can you talk a bit more about how important that is?
Yeah.
Because I think folks usually, they might know their industry or their domain and adjacent particularly well, whether it's competitors or customers or maybe pipelines of talent. But I think it's sometimes hard to take that 30,000-foot level view and see, okay, where are the complementaries between the public sector and the private sector? How does academia fit into those activities? And then, of course, getting everyone to buy into a vision where everyone is working towards a common goal is a completely separate process.
Yeah. No, it's really easy. I'll give you two examples. I'll try to be quick on both because both were created over the last year or so. So the Colorado Media Project, a year ago, Denver Post, which is the only surviving paper that serves the whole Colorado region, owned by a private equity group out of New York, had laid off, gone through its last round of layoffs.
Yeah.
Things were a mess. So a number of us got together and said, well, what do we do about this? And we said, well, we could buy the Post. We decided that was a foolhardy thing to try to do, but then decided we didn't want to just say, well, we're not going to buy the Post and whatever happens, happens, because, without journalism, democracy dies. I mean, I believe that fundamentally. So we got together and said, well, let's try to understand what's going on. So we got private foundation money. We used the University of Denver as the platform, the place where a bunch of activity could happen. We did a bunch of design thinking kind of activities over the course of the summer. I got the Boston Consulting Group to devote a team of people to do some really, really great analytical work to understand where were people getting their news and how is that changing and how does that differ demographically across the state, et cetera. And spent the summer just sprinting really as a kind of community collective around the question of what's happening to community news and information in Colorado. And again, went into this where we said to everybody, look, we don't know what we're going to find. We don't know if this is going to come up with anything that suggests we ought to do more work, et cetera. But we at least ought to have a better understanding of what's going on. And let's take this positive step in light of this negative thing that's going on, rather than just sort of sit around and wring our hands and complain and worry. So we did that work, came through the end of the summer, said, it looks like there's some interesting ways to fill that gap. You actually can come up with alternatives. And there were two things in particular. One was, one thing, and a lot of it has to do with what we were talking about before. There's just this real capacity building capability that's required. You've got a bunch of really interesting new digital startups. There's this thing called the Colorado Sun, which was a bunch of Denver Post reporters who spun off, funded by an entity out of New York called Civil at the time, you may have heard of, had some blockchain connectivity, et cetera. And had an awesome start. So through the Colorado Media Project, we then got the Boston Consulting Group to write a 10-year business plan for them, right? Because we said the capacity building that they need is not journalism. They're wonderful at that, but they don't know from what does a business plan look like. So let's do that. And now we're in the process of pulling together the financing for that for the long haul. But that was an example where the real need has been to bring business and tech/product capability to traditional journalism as fast as possible to water the news desert. And if you can do that, and if you can do that on a community basis for a lot less than the price of trying to buy some old newspaper, you can essentially create the volume of content that otherwise, the community would be bereft of. But that's taken a lot of work with a lot of different entities to move things forward. So that's one example. Another is artificial intelligence, where Senator Bennett approached me a few months ago, said, look, at the federal level, we're not doing anything from an AI policy point of view, really, of substance. And we're certainly not funding anything, even if we're coming up with some rhetoric around it. And certainly not funding anything relative to what the Chinese are trying to do. And there are things that we've done in Colorado, like the Blackstone Entrepreneurs Network. We brought the U.S. Patent and Trade Office into the state, which was a big, helpful thing to do a few years ago, et cetera, that allowed Colorado to kind of compete in these sectors at a scale and in a way that were quite different. So the thesis was, well, Colorado can do something around AI as Colorado, qua Colorado, that would stand up, be durable, be interesting. But what is that? Well, we don't know. So let's convene, a series of sessions. We've done some
Yeah.
design thinking things, and let's bring a whole bunch. We have, like 50 people around the table, and it's everything from Lockheed Martin and Microsoft to tiny startups to attorneys concerned about the ethical implications, et cetera, et cetera. And we got this, thing that we got our hands in that we're trying to figure out what it is. What will emerge from that? Not sure. Is it that we're going to have some kind of collaborative across the 33 federal research labs in the state and higher ed and industry to collectively make us more attractive to AI kind of talent? What would that mean? Where would the focus be, et cetera? It's messy, but if we hadn't started that conversation with that kind of plethora of interests at the table, we wouldn't. We can only scale by virtue of collaborating across those interests. We can only compete nationally or internationally by virtue of going through these messy collaborative kind of processes, and now showing that we can stand up and be an icon. If you look at Governor Hickenlooper's platform in running for president, a lot of what he'll tell you is that's what's unique about him. He was able to bring all these interests together to make a lot of great things happen over the long period of time in Colorado, fundamentally change the state, particularly around things like innovation. And the only way you could do that was cross-sectorally, cross disciplines, cross party in his case. So at any rate, I think the lesson in all these things is that that is how Colorado can uniquely play. Again, you look at things like Denver Startup Week or Techstars. They're not obvious before they started as things that necessarily could scale the way that they did, and they're inherently kind of collaborative in many ways, but they're not historically single focused the way that we might think about it. It's not we're going to be better in robotics and ag. It's okay. How do we collectively play as Colorado in AI? That's an interesting question. Let's collectively try to figure it out. But it's hard work. It takes a lot of focus, takes a lot of dedication, making sure that gets maintained, across various folks' engagement roles. So when a senator decides that he's going to run for president, what do you do with an initiative like that? How do you make sure that it kind of sustains? Is part of the challenge in creating those. But I think what we've been able to do is create a collective will that the community collectively has this collaborative opportunity to distinguish itself, and that the collaboration itself is a lot of what is going to distinguish itself. And therefore, we should all sort of lay our arms down when we get together and try to figure these things out and do so in a productive way. It's not, sound Pollyannish because, some of the stuff just doesn't work. And your questions, sometimes they won't necessarily endure or themselves scale as they should.
I'd imagine that trying to build up that Colorado-ness, if you will, especially in the minds of folks outside of Colorado, requires a lot of time spent outside of the state and meeting with people who might not be very familiar with Colorado and might not know about some of these initiatives that you've described. I'm curious to know if any of the components of the Colorado Media Project have been replicated in other markets.
It's a great question, and that's a good one. I'm glad you asked about that one, because that's one where the answer is yes. If you ask about others, I'd have to say, well, not so much. Yeah, we spent a lot of time during the convenings, part of the work during the summer, connecting with everybody externally. So there's a group out of Philadelphia, for example, called LenFest, and we've done a lot of work with them. There's a new initiative called the American Journalism Project, which the co-founder of Austin Ventures and the founder of the Texas Tribune has gotten going. It's about a $50 million fund to invest in these things. We're tightly connected with that group, the Knight Foundation. So we've used this as a mechanism to connect not just within Colorado, but to those kind of external players as well, and raise a lot of awareness about what we're doing. And so it gets talked a lot about in those circles as an example of a way for a community to self-organize to solve for the problem.
And when you're interacting with these other groups, is it is that a component of the branding, like an initiative of the Colorado Media Project?
Yeah, we've been pretty intentional. You'll notice project is a theme when I name these things, like they're all projects. But yes, we've been very intentional about that going through the entity. So, there's an executive director of the entity. There's an executive committee of the entity. The executive director of the entity is always involved in all of those conversations first. Sometimes it starts from somewhere else, but you always want it to be the entity itself that is the bridge carrier rather than around the entity, or at least that's my view, because otherwise the risk is that, there's too much of a diaspora of influence.
Yes.
But so that's one that's that's worked well in that regard. The flip side, though, is that in general, those communities are all populated by people whose backgrounds are more similar than dissimilar and subject to the same constraints that the media ecosystem in Colorado itself is subject to, meaning they're almost all former journalists. And, a lot of the issue is not journalism. A lot of the issue is business and product and tech capability.
Yeah, how to be sustainable.
How to be sustainable.
Profitable.
How do you get, Latinas in the northeastern corner of Colorado to care about local content? Well, it's not, better long form written content only. You got to manage social in a really interesting way. You got to do video. You've got to do things in an entirely different fashion. So making sure that effort doesn't get caught up in historical reflections that journalists are having about their own discipline has been, it's back to the point you made. A lot of what we have to do is just bring technical and business capability and clash it with the journalists all the time. That's what that project's got to keep doing. And it's going to be fresh. And as it connects to these other entities around the country, many of which are populated by former journalists too, you run the risk of it being a lot of, great, we're going to have just even longer articles with less frequency that, that folks won't read. And that's not,
Well, I'll certainly be interested to follow the progress of the Colorado Media Project as it scales across the U.S. and even perhaps in other markets as well. We're getting close to conclusion time. So I want to know, is there anything that you would like to share that we haven't covered or that I haven't asked you about? And that can be as related to you or Colorado or anything in the future that you're interested in, or even as general as the best advice that you've ever received.
Well, I appreciate that. And I appreciate you taking the time. It's been great to talk to you. And, earthquakes can be good things because they make connections that otherwise wouldn't happen. They don't just create schisms. No, I think a lot of what is interesting from my perspective is that global connectivity. So the kind of work that you've been doing, for example, I think is going to become, in some ways, even more critical in a world where, nation states tend to be withdrawing.
Yeah.
So how do you, in spite of that, create this? I'm just a fundamental believer that greater connectivity across those traditional boundaries is where the strength lies. And I think that's as true across any kind of nation state or other sort of border as it is across industry sectors or other. So when I think about Colorado, I think a lot about, how do we now connect these kind of initiatives, not just promote them, but connect them in some kind of sustainable and interesting way. And, that's why frameworks for me, like the Sustainable Development Goals, the Solution Summit, the UN did, et cetera. Are there these frames? Are there these organizing kinds of principles, activities, things that are branded otherwise that can be these kind of envelopes under which all of us can collectively do the work that we're doing and then get the benefits of sort of networked economies in a more efficient and effective way? I think that's going to become even more critical going forward because the barriers are going up between, at the federal level, between nation states, et cetera, at a pretty astonishing rate given where we were 8 years ago. But nonetheless, connecting across is going to be, I think, where the strength is created.
Yeah, I completely agree, and especially complementary strengths and finding ways to add value in new ways and perhaps even in seemingly disparate communities. SDGs, of course, are a great starting point for that shared dialogue of how to cooperate and, of course, collaborate, especially across sector. Sometimes the words, the vocabulary is different, but I think in the end, it's stakeholders, beneficiaries, clients, what have you, to try and make things a bit better than they were previously. So on that note, I want to thank you, JB, for the time that you've taken for this interview. Really appreciate it. And we'll certainly be looking forward to whatever is next in store for you, both at the University of Denver and travels-wise. Who knows where else we'll meet in the world? And hopefully there won't be a disaster, natural or otherwise, associated with our next meeting. So thanks very much and all the best and safe travels back.
Thanks. And same to you. Thanks very much for the time.
Thanks so much.
I wish JB and I had more time to keep the conversation going. Massachusetts, New York, and California usually dominate talks and themes about innovation and entrepreneurship in the United States, especially when it comes to investment. So it's great to hear more about Colorado and the niche that leaders across the state have helped to carve for the Centennial State. After meeting with JB, it's clear that there are exciting things happening in Colorado beyond the names and brands dominating the news headlines. I'll definitely have to spend more time in Colorado the next time I head out west. It already has my favorite concert venue, Red Rocks Amphitheater, just outside of Denver. Thank you, JB, for a wonderful dialogue, and I am appreciative of the time we shared. I hope you'll join us next week when I'll be interviewing a Peruvian entrepreneur whose company was recently acquired after spending almost 20 years in the San Francisco Bay Area. In the meantime, feel free to reach out directly to me if you'd like to learn more information about the Planetary Potential Podcast, or if you'd like to learn more about upcoming interviews. Thank you.